Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel on partnerships, public-private partnerships. My name is Brett Kubicek. I'm a manager of something called the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. I work for the Government of Canada, and it's basically our program to support domestic capacity building on developing more evidence-based, effective approaches to preventing and countering violent extremism, and it's all through partnership. So we're going to cover a number of themes around that here today. I know it's late on a long day. We lost one of our speakers. We have an intimate audience. We're going to try and make this a little more conversational. And to give you a sense, even as we were talking amongst ourselves, getting ready for the panel, I expect that where we're going to get through some of our discussions is we're two general themes, and they both are on the aspect of time. In terms of, on the one hand, time in terms of sustainability of partnerships, the challenges for that. How do you sort of make things last over time? It's often a real challenge for a field of, all sorts of prevention, violence prevention, especially prevention in the field of preventing and countering violent extremism, and we'll hear about some of those challenges. But the other aspect of time that was quite interesting is adaptability. Like, how do you shift quickly when the threat environment changes, or you learn a lesson about, promising practice? Like, how do you move what can be sometimes complicated, bureaucratic government person partnerships to when there's something key that changes in the environment that means you need to change. So we did, as you saw in the program, we were supposed to have the Assistant Secretary from DHS responsible for partnerships. Unfortunately, she sends her regrets. So I'll do a little more government-y stuff, but hopefully in a way that is interesting, and turn it over to our colleagues shortly. So as noted, a big part of my role as research manager at our program is to try and bring the evidence base and the networks and connections together to support partnerships to help develop prevention in Canada. And we run into all sorts of hard problems. There is limited evidence base for doing prevention in this space. It's hard to measure impact. The stakes are high. The pressure to act is often sort of immediate, even though it can take us a while to move, even when the pressure is immediate. And a lot of the evidence we do have is on harmful unintended consequences. And there's stigma and fear around issues like violent extremism, terrorism, hate crime, even just to find partners with relevant skill sets and convince them. Much of my early career was trying to find really promising academics and researchers and try and nudge them towards studying some of the problems in our field. And their own, even when they were interested, their own disciplines were like, I'm not sure we want you doing that. But how do we get through that? A lot of it is through learning through partnerships, and a lot of our partnerships has been with international partners, definitely from the US, but European, Nordic countries, Australia, but also from other sectors. Some of the early prevention work we've done in Canada has been to help connect. A number of you have seen Moonshot represented here, and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue represented here, two UK-based organizations, both of whom have now significant partnerships with frontline prevention practitioners and researchers in Canada. So bringing their expertise often on the online environment with local knowledge of people who work on the ground in local communities in Canada. Another lesson that we wanted to try and bring to Canada early on was looking at the EU's Radicalization Awareness Network, which has kind of a partnership model right at its heart. Its core intuition was recognizing that people working on these fringe, difficult forms of preventing extreme forms of violence are often quite isolated, and just to connect them so that they can learn from each other and share lessons and build the field. We wanted to do that in Canada too, and one of our first investments was to create something called the Canadian Practitioners Network for the Prevention of Radicalization and Extremist Violence. Take some of the intuitions of the EU's RAN, but then sort of go to another level, invest a lot more in their capacity building, their ability to do research and training, and sort of really help the field grow. And a lot of that is to support them in their work to develop partnerships amongst clinicians, social workers, law enforcement, community NGOs, as well as government partners. So yeah, a lot of it's about capacity building through partnerships, but that issue of problems still comes up on a regular basis, and there's a front of mind reason right now. The whole purpose of this conference, not the whole, but a big purpose for this conference is we're all wrestling with growth in forms of hate-motivated violent extremism. And we are seeing that in Canada, and we're getting a lot of pressure to move prevention upstream. And that means engaging more with sectors that are uncomfortable with some of these issues. There's still that issue of fear and stigma and we've had a lot of lessons learned about bringing issues of terrorism and violent extremism into education and school settings. Yep. Things can go sideways. Yep. You have to be really careful. And so we are in a situation now where we're being pushed to adapt, build new partnerships with sectors that are not necessarily fully comfortable with the idea. So having a conversation like this, thinking about some of the lessons learned, the ongoing challenges that we have is definitely important for us, and very grateful to have three very capable people here with me today. David Kartenstein Ross, founder and CEO of Valens Global, who we've known for a long time and still, I'm sorry. Humaira Khan, president and co-founder of Muflihun, and as we often joke, Brett's Across Borders. Brett Steele, director of prevention and national security from the McCain Institute. And I'm going to start off, David, asking you to kick us off. One of the things that was nice about our call is you had this kind of strategic perspective on partnership, thinking about it in context of bigger questions about prevention and threat. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about your perspective on partnership.
Great. Thanks so much, Brett. And I'll say my name again, just so
Thank
people
you,
get it.
Please.
David Gartenstein Ross.
Thank you.
Valens Global.
Thank you.
Nice to see you all, including everyone online. So my own career has straddled across both the public and the private. I've largely been private throughout my career. First in the think tank sphere and academia, and then starting my own private company. But I've also held U.S. government equivalent positions during points in this career, including in the prevention space. I worked at the end of the Obama administration and through the beginning of the Trump administration for the Office for Community Partnerships at the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. It was obviously very interesting to see the contrast between the two administrations in this regard. The spoiler alert is that office got completely gutted by the end of 2017 as my time there was done. We fought the good fight, we lost, but prevention is back. I think there's three kinds of ways I conceptualize public-private partnerships. One of them is in the prevention space, which I think is very important because, for a variety of reasons. But everyone on this panel does prevention work, with me and Valens being the least deep in this. We learn a lot from Humaira and from the Bretts Across Borders. Secondly is essential institutions. Partnerships with a company like Meta or Twitter, tech companies, is going to be absolutely important because tech companies are institutions in their own right. So much of what is relevant to the prevention space will be posted there. Messages that incite. A tech company with good policies, whether it's takedowns or redirect, or even thinking through how do they create a different kind of online atmosphere, that will make a big difference in terms of the outputs of violent extremism. They're a necessary partner to engage. And then third, there's what we could call implementing partners, which would be a company like Valens, for example. Muflihun is both kind of an implementing partner and also one in the prevention space. But the implementing partner will, across any number of outputs, not necessarily prevention, not just prevention, but whether it's analysis or strategic frameworks or technology, that partner will be essential for moving the government forward. So in looking at this, I want to outline where partners come in, where private partners come in, and what the pitfalls are. I think that there's two major advantages I see to private partners working with the government. There's many others, But the two big ones that I see in terms of what private partners can offer that government cannot, in terms of getting something done, is first speed. Private institutions are able to work more quickly than government. And like in my own career, I've seen that at times when something needs to get done. So one of the things I'm very proud of is I was the drafter of DHS's 2019 strategic framework for countering terrorism and targeted violence, which changed our priorities for DHS, recognizing the increasing role of domestic terrorism. For various reasons, that had to get done in 3.5 weeks. It's a speed at which government couldn't move when you look at not just drafting it, but the executive secretary process and the interagency and the like. The second thing is creativity and innovation. Drawing on not just government, but drawing on all the creativity that society has to offer, to me, produces a spark that is new, that you won't necessarily get from within government. There's a third thing as well, but I know it will be spoken to after me, but that is government. We have a representative government, we're a democracy, but not everyone sees it that way, right? Not everyone sees that government perfectly represents them, and clearly it doesn't, right? We have different things like gerrymandering, we have an imperfect system. And so being able to reach across communities is done better through private partnership. So the final thing I'll say very quickly, because Brett mentions metrics, and that's so important when you look at especially the sustainability of prevention efforts. The critique is often made, well, where are the metrics? Is prevention making a difference? This is something I heard back in 2016. It's something you can hear now in 2022. And I think that there's a couple of things I'd just point to briefly. The first is that if you look at the money spent on prevention versus everything else we've done within counterterrorism, prevention spending in the US is just dwarfed. We've spent probably trillions of dollars in what was once called the global war on terror. And we've spent, a fraction of that on prevention efforts, with some years, US government spending on prevention being not quite, but close to zero. A budget that fluctuates and doesn't have that sustainability. And it can be difficult to get metrics in this area, but those metrics will only come out over time. And to me, it's important because you don't want to spend on cleaning up after the attack. You want to figure out, how can we make these attacks, these acts of hate, less? And the role of government, the role of prevention is so important.
Thank you. It's a nice setup for you, Humera, because a good bit of our discussion was also about sustainability, and I'm wondering if you can bring it as that more sort of prevention implementer, the how to do the partnership. That's a lot of what we were looking for you to teach us about.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, thank you to Eradicate Hate for having this panel actually on it. So I'm going to talk about public-private partnerships, but a little bit more in the traditional model, because they were public-private partnerships came up around infrastructure, where you actually had private sector building out infrastructure, which the government was either not able to fund or did not have for various reasons. It was more effective if private sector provided that service. It was still for government interest because it was meeting the greater good. What we're seeing there now is that public-private partnerships, or PPPs, right, that whole sector is moving towards social good. So now there's a whole lot of PPPs which are coming up around climate, various different sectors. And in our sector, which is on preventing hate and extremism, PPPs are extremely underutilized. We have a lot of partnerships, right? We have a lot of grant-making mechanisms, but we don't have that PPP model built in. So I'm going to talk about it in the context of what are some of the needs that we have identified for a PPP to, one, exist, but to be sustainable, right? Because we're seeing that there's a shift, and it's a different need in that. So I'm going to talk about it actually in the context of one of the grants we've received. It's funded by the federal government. It's a DHS grant. But the service that we have built, we are providing it for local governments. And when you talked about what's the speed of delivery, it's one of those where we can adapt or move much faster to provide a service which the local governments need, but the federal government would take them a lot longer. And so we have a certain efficiency in that we are able to provide. So, you have mentioned the partnerships, right? David alluded to political will, right? Because that's a huge part of any of this space. It's extremely politicized, so political will is important. But scalability and replication, necessary. And I'm going to leave some of the other panelists to discuss that. But there's two other aspects which we must talk about, and that's going to be on the actual local need and that alignment with political will. And the other one is economic feasibility and revenue generating models. Because it's not sustainable to expect our programs, any sort of implementation, to just run indefinitely on government grants. So we have to start thinking about, are there revenue generating models and where? And are any of our programs actually feasible? If they're not economically feasible, they're not sustainable. So we got funding from DHS CP3, their prevention program, and you've heard several of our plenary speakers have talked about that particular grant funding. So it's an innovation grant where we have actually built out a platform which uses big data, machine learning, to identify for a particular location what are the priority risk factors and protective factors for them. So instead of expecting that governments will have indefinite resources and apply to everything, we're using data over the last 20 years to understand, okay, for this location, which risk factors should be mitigated, and which are the protective factors which have to be enhanced. And then we're working with the local governments to help them design strategies and prevention frameworks for them, which is not at that national, federal, state level, but right down to the nitty-gritty of this is the population, they have elected me, now what do I do? Right? It's very, very practical, because reality is, it also feeds into how they do budget allocations. Because when you take a multi-sectoral approach, as a public health approach, we are talking about every sector. We are talking about arts and sports and civics. We're talking about education, health, access to health, quality of any of these sectors, right? Economics, and it's not just about law enforcement. And I think one thing which this conference has emphasized, it is not about law enforcement only, and it cannot just be about that. So this is what we're doing, right? And our models that we're looking at, we are focusing on REMV, right? Racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. We're looking at hate crimes, and we're looking at school gun incidents. And our expansion out is actually going to be gun violence writ large. But as I mentioned, right, we can't rely solely on government funding, right? Because again, it's politicized, it's uncertain, it's tiny drops in the bucket for what's actually needed. So we actually have to come up with revenue generating models. But before I go there, let me tell you the reality of actually trying to do this. It's one thing to talk about political will at the federal level, right? Administration has strategies, et cetera, in place. Everyone talks about it. But if the local need is not there, and not just is the need not there, if the local government representatives do not acknowledge the need, it does not matter. And we face that, right? We went in there, and everyone went in there thinking, oh, wow, we have identified. So I'll give you an actual example. A particular state shall remain unnamed for the moment. It's in the top 5 locations which have seen domestic terrorism perpetrators living in that state. It's the state of habitation, and it's in the top 5, right? So there's clearly things which are happening at that local level. We approached every single county in that state. We went to mayors, county executives, if they wanted to be part of our pilot, right? They said, and it doesn't cost them anything, because again, this particular innovation grant is funded by the federal government. It doesn't cost anything at the local level. Across the board, they said no. No way, because we don't want to raise the issue with our constituents, right? Some of them just said, oh, no, just think about the history of the state. This is not an issue, right? We had sheriff's offices telling the elected officials, please, this is a primary prevention program. Let's try this out, because if we do this, it means there's less load on us downstream, right? There was county executives who wanted to do it, and their cabinet said no, because it doesn't look good. There was not a single taker in that state at all, right? Henry County. And on the other hand, we do have pilot locations. And our pilot locations, their leadership acknowledged there's a need, right? 2 of our pilot locations are in Pennsylvania. One of them has got 3 different militias which are operating on the borders. And they're like, look, we have to do something about this. Some of our other pilot locations said, look, we couldn't care less about REMV. That's the federal government thing. Let's talk about hate crimes.
Yeah.
Right? And then we had other locations which said, forget all that. Our issue is school safety. So one of the things we had to do is we also have to adapt the service that we're providing to meet the needs, the actual needs at that local governance level. Because when you have the political will and you have the buy-in, then the money comes. But if you don't have that, right, the need has to be there and it has to be acknowledged. And then only can you start to execute. And so this has been, so like for sustainability, right, that's the only way that you can have an awesome product, right? But without all the pieces lining up of that partnership, right, of the political will at the local level, at the national level, of making sure there's a revenue generating model, because we need that to sustain the program, not just the creation of the program, but for it to implement over time, right, to make sure we have the scalability, to make sure we are able to replicate it, because otherwise it's not going to work. All of those pieces have to align, right? And getting that alignment, that's where the magic happens, and oh my gosh, so much work too.
Yeah, I feel like that is a nice transition to Brett. I'm just sort of thinking about all the various pieces that you are trying to align. Even just think about your current job, your previous ones as well, but you have a remarkable number of projects that are partnerships of different forms and different sectors. And again, that question of the how comes up, and I wonder if you can reflect a bit on your own experience.
So first of all, raise your hand if you think your state might be the state Jumana mentioned. I think that may be most of us in this room. That could apply to many. So I spent 9 years in the federal government, and I've now spent nearly 4 years at the McCain Institute. And I've worked public-private partnerships on both sides of the public and the private. Right now, I'm kind of quasi, because the McCain Institute is part of Arizona State University, which is technically an Arizona State employee. But I wanted to look at both benefits of public-private partnerships and challenges of public-private partnerships. Because I've worked all the different types of awards. As Brett said, I currently have 9 federal awards and multiple private sector partnerships as well. So it takes a lot of different partnerships to cobble together this work, and that's a reality too. When David mentioned that some years the investment in prevention was 0, up until 2016, the investment in public-private partnerships for prevention by the U.S. government for the 5 years prior, so 2011 to 2016, less than $1 million total across those 5 years combined. That has gotten modestly better since then. There are a series of grant programs now. The Department of Homeland Security just announced $20 million in grants last Thursday. But as David mentioned, that's still a drop in the bucket relative to broader investments in more law enforcement-oriented approaches to this problem. So what are those benefits to public-private partnerships? One of them, David already mentioned, and that's speed. We can be more nimble. U.S. government got a 1-year head start on us on running a nationwide prevention campaign. Ours launched last week. No launch date in sight for kind of USG produced campaign. It's just harder. I've been in those U.S. government roles. It takes time to get the buy-in and to get all of the approvals. If you've never heard of Executive Secretariat, which David mentioned, be glad. Your life is better for it. But it takes time when you're in the federal government to get the buy-in from every single department and agency that has an equity, from every component of your department that has an equity, and from leadership, not just within your department, but also in Congress. So when you build a public-private partnership, that private partner may be able to move faster and be more nimble. Second, at times, they may have greater credibility. So when I am implementing the Invent to Prevent program alongside Adventure Partners, that program is funded by the Department of Homeland Security. But when I do outreach to recruit schools for that program as a public university, we have greater credibility in reaching out to universities to get them to participate in that program because we are recognized as an academic partner. And so you may have greater credibility. The third, and this shouldn't be the case, but I believe it is, you may have greater bandwidth for programming and public-private partnerships. Because when I was in my government roles, I had to spend so much time getting leadership buy-in, getting congressional buy-in, lining up the resources, that now on the private side of public-private partnerships, I can truly focus on the programming and devote a lot more time to implementation. And so those are some of the benefits to those partnerships. On the challenges side, the flip side of credibility. Some doors are better opened by the government partner. We're doing outreach right now for the Prevention Practitioners Network to build a directory of all of the providers across the United States who may be relevant in preventing targeted violence or terrorism. When you're reaching out to state officials to find out their school safety resources, that call may come better from DHS than from me. Some states it may come better from me. But that's why that partnership is so important, because sometimes the government may have greater credibility and sometimes the private partner may have greater credibility, and you need to work closely to leverage those relationships when possible. Another thing we're finding is duplication of effort. Sometimes as that political will shifts, as priorities shift, suddenly government says, oh, we need to do this work. And they forget that they're already funding someone to do it. So making sure that as we build these public-private partnerships, we're always working closely together to avoid any duplication of effort. There's not enough resources in this field to be duplicating effort. Replication, another matter, extremely important. We absolutely need to take models and see if we can replicate them across different contexts. Can't afford to duplicate same projects, same place, same time, same purpose. And finally, one of the challenges is funding structures. Humera has been very innovative in trying to find revenue-generating models. Yeah. Not every program can do that so quickly. Yeah. It's really a challenge, especially when working with underserved communities. And so we coordinate the Prevention Practitioners Network. We've got over 875 interdisciplinary professionals across the country doing this work who have participated in our workshops to date. And what I see among the practitioners who participate in that network is it can take a year to spin up your program once you receive one of these awards. And if it's a 2-year period of performance, you need to be looking for your next source of funding at that year point. You may not even have proof of concept yet, but you need to line up your next source of funding. And the way some of these grant programs are structured, they're structured as seed grants. And the implication of seed grants is that you need to go out and find sustainable sources of funding outside of the federal government stream to continue that work. So you're either continuously coming up with new programs to propose so that you can continue getting seed grants, or you're finding alternate sources of funding. And I would argue that for some types of public-private partnerships, we need longer funding horizons. For some of these projects that may take longer to implement, longer to show results. And we also need to make sure that we're building in that adaptability of funding. So one of the models when I was at the US Department of Justice that our local leaders absolutely loved was the Project Safe Neighborhoods model. Because there you applied as a coalition, you got resources that were pooled at the local level, but you got to decide as that local coalition how to apply those resources, where to surge them, how to adapt them, and realize what's working, and surge more resources there, what's not working, and maybe shut off that resource stream there. And as the threat landscape changes, surge those resources accordingly as well. So looking at those different funding models to allow for that adaptability.
I was going to ask one more round of questions, but hoping to turn to the audience soon. But I wanted to sort of build on that adaptability aspect a bit more, and especially if you can think of some concrete examples for us. I definitely at times feel fortunate for our program. We were able to copy-paste from a broader crime prevention funding program in Canada that uses a basic 5-year core funding model in comparison to counterparts internationally that are often funding countering violent extremism programs, even more like 1 year, 18 months. And so, as you say, you're just starting to get the thing going, let alone having the time to evaluate it and adapt and adjust. But we're also finding, so it's on the one hand has enabled us to allow programs to adapt. There's even sort of built-in flex into a funding agreement. And for us, it's one of those things that's sort of good news, bad news. But when the Toronto van attack happened, an incel-driven incident of mass murder, our prevention initiative had a number of ongoing funding partnerships, as well as opportunities to work with organizations that we built trust with over time to sort of surge, sort of research, frontline prevention, sort of support the development of more knowledge and capacity for people working on the front lines to sort of just even adapt their tools to that environment. But it was in part because we were able to have these longer term models. The flip is that we're still one of the only funders in Canada, and that crime prevention model was built like 5 years, develop, implement, evaluate, and assume somebody else is going to pick up when you have an evidence-based program. But for areas like CVE, there aren't that many other funders. So we're even questioning, do we need to go beyond 5 if we can't help? But I'm just often find those concrete examples of where you've seen positive examples of shift, of adaptation to a change. Do you have any in mind, or are there things about, I know we're very easily can talk about the barriers to sustainability and adaptability, but some examples of where you've seen nimbleness in terms of partnership?
And so by nimbleness, you mean nimbleness in terms of being able to take that seed funding and shift it into something sustainable.
Or something happens, an opportunity pops up, or something changes in the environment. And
I can jump in. We, with the Invent to Prevent program, we challenge high schools and universities to design products, tools, or initiatives to prevent targeted violence or terrorism. We decided we were going to do a pilot in 10 high schools and try it out. And about halfway into the year, we realized this was really working and the high schools were doing a phenomenal job. And rather than sticking with those 10 schools, we surged it up to 25 in that pilot year, and immediately got the question at the end of the year, how quickly can you get to 100? And made that shift of initially we were scaling universities and keeping high schools small, and kept universities small and scaled high schools, because that's where we were seeing the greatest interest, the greatest need, and the greatest impact.
do you have a...
I think there's actually a lot of examples of where this happens, which may be kind of either cautionary tales or else examples of things working really well. Since these are companies that I admire, I'll say that it's the latter. But let me make the opposite case first, because Valens would be one of the examples.
Of course.
Basically, for a private company, if you're working in the prevention space, the way you build sustainability is by understanding, because there's so few PVE, CVE, prevention sources of funding, you have to understand what the core skill set you have is, and then flip that core skill set to other problem sets. And that can be positive. The argument that is negative would be that it gets you away from a core prevention mission, that like you're spread out across. So I think Moonshot is very similar to Valens in this way, that they had this core capability. We first worked with them on the redirect program for Jigsaw/Google, and they ran with that, and since then have expanded into a VC-funded company. But it's this core skill set which is adaptable to them across multiple problem sets. For Valens, when you look at prevention work that we've done, we've taken the question of, we're looking so we look at multiple aspects of prevention. Some is, material designed to radicalize online in the digital space. Some is mis/disinformation that has a nexus. And that's adaptable in different ways. For some of our clients, we work with them in crisis communication situations to use those same principles to help guide them through. For other clients, it's kind of looking at a range of information to understand different narratives that are out there, for them to either make decisions based upon narratives or to understand where these narratives can influence the reputation of the company. These are all taking that core skill set. And so I think that you have an on the one hand, on the other. I think the argument ultimately that this is good is that it creates an expansion of what you're able to do, and that core prevention capability is there. And we don't need to constantly have grants. Instead, what we're able to do is to flip it back to prevention when it aligns with needs that exist without constantly doing prevention work. But since I know it's going to go to Humera next, I want to actually talk about my admiration for what you do. Because Brett mentioned how, because Humera is very focused on prevention along with her partner Adnan. And Brett mentioned Humera's adaptability in looking at things. And what I want to say as a fellow founder is that something like Mufflehund is such a labor of love. I know how hard you work and how long you've worked at it. And for those of you who haven't founded an organization, I think if you understood kind of how hard Humera works, you would say, like, you have to be crazy to decide to put this kind of effort in. But the reason I point to that, like, there's both admiration, but also it points to the question of, is what we have here enough to sustain this? Because I know how hard you work and how often, there are these questions of, sustainability of your own efforts.
So in all fairness, I'm called crazy for other reasons too.
Me too.
Right? But we'll just stick with this one. Yes, Muflihun is a labor of love. And since we were founded in 2010, reality is we have stayed focused on how do you actually cultivate that community resilience and build better societies, right? But the other part of that is that we have had to shift for our organizational sustainability, which is separate from a program sustainability or a particular partnership we might have for a very specific end. We have done various types of programming, right? So it's not as though we only have this one project, right? We also do capacity building. We have other types of engagements which can help keep the organization running. But in terms of adapting, right, one of the things we found through this, the project I talked about, the CRUISE, Community Resilience Early Warning System. So the same state, right, which said, no, we will not touch anything related to extremism or hate, forget that. One of the things which we got asked over and over again is, can you do gun violence? Over and over again, we got questions on gun violence. So part of that is we can take our methodology. We have open source data. Right, we're using public data. There's no PII, so it's not about individuals. This is aggregate at a community level. We made sure we're following like ethical principles to safeguard privacy and not stigmatize communities and working in that space, right? But the reality is that we can actually expand it to other forms of violence. So we are still staying in the prevention space, but we are actually adding different and new partners. So for gun violence reduction and actually working in primary prevention, it's not just about here's a platform. It's the methodology, it's the process. So we're working with partners who that's their area. So in how we're adapting it is that we can take what we do well and we can be a part of their process. Right? So it's how, like for organizationally, we engage in different ways. It's not just that it has to be our project or our process. We can be a part of others also. So again, partnerships work in many different ways. But yes, it is a labor of love. Don't we all want to save the world? Right? That's why we are here, right? We believe it.
Amen.
Yeah. And again, but the other part of that is, can we feed it back into the policy space?
Yeah.
Because the policy space, taking what's happening on the ground, what we are learning, and then being able to translate it back into policy space, that's a gap. And like, several of you know, right? So I worked at the United Nations Security Council's Counterterrorism Directorate, and there I was actually coming up with policy recommendations on how Security Council resolutions should be implemented. And what you realize is you have all this learning from the field, but how does that ever get translated into something a policymaker can use and apply it and build out a Security Council resolution which is going to apply to 192 member states, right? And there's a gap there because the stuff that we are learning, and we're learning a lot of stuff, right? And is how it's going to be applied. So even in our system, right, that we built, the types of things we're learning is amazing, right? Because we have found, you know what, every place is different. You just cannot generalize on it. We have found places where if you're looking at extremism, it's a cluster. So you have to look at the mental health or access to mental health coupled with, and now specifically when you're talking about REMV, actually things like bullying and school bullying comes into play. Whereas if you're looking at hate, it doesn't. Same location, right? So the risk factors and the prioritization of risk factors and protective factors shift depending on the type of issue you're dealing with. But what we are finding is amazing similarities because one thing we have seen is across the board, doesn't matter the type of violence, when you're talking about social cohesion and investment in social cohesion, it's hugely protective. Yeah. We have found in pretty much every community that we have checked out in the US, somewhere between 2014 and 2016, substance abuse and opioid deaths actually became a risk factor across the board. There was no exception. So we're trying to see maybe there are exceptions, right? Are there? And this is how we'll continue to experiment to see. Because for us, that means that When we are talking to the local governments, we're talking about who has to be at the table. And here's the data that you should bring your other stakeholders to the table. Have your education sector there, because the spending you do per school, it's not even the curriculum. It's the quality of what you're providing, and are you providing it equally to your populations, right? And how do you do that? So it's, yeah.
Very cool.
You will keep fighting the good fight.
Good.
And Brett, I think you and I have to start on another panel in 8 minutes.
I know. I was
That's not in
assuming
this
they're
room.
behind. No, I know. I did want to turn it to the audience, though. Yes.
I was just a follow-up question. Brett, you mentioned the rapid scaling of the work you were doing in schools.
Yeah.
And yet one of the challenges of this work is you're trying to prevent horrible but hopefully relatively rare events. How were you able to know quickly that it was having the desired impact? What were the measures you used to give you confidence that it was worth scaling?
So one of the things about Invent to Prevent is it is a very innovative program, and each of the teams creates their own initiatives using their own tactics, which means they have their own metrics. We were looking at, so we're partnered with a evaluation team in France. The University of Nebraska is evaluating the program in France, and knock wood, we'll soon start evaluating the program in the United States. Before we had that independent academic evaluation start, we were looking at the metrics that we were helping the students, design metrics for their own programs. So I do office hours with each of the students' teams to help them think through. What are those protective factors you're trying to bolster? And then B, how are you measuring whether you're having the intended impact? And then we were looking at those metrics coming out of the teams. We try wherever possible to get the teams to pre and post test. So we could actually see within their school climate that pre and post test result. We could also see the reach they were getting, the extent to which a lot of our teams are trying to get, they have to have a call to action. So how many people are actually engaging in that call to action? Can we measure that? And is that call to action aligned with the appropriate scope of the program? So those were some of the metrics we were looking at.
Thank you. And I think with that, we'll have to wrap us up so we can all get to our next panels. But hopefully we're all around for the cocktail hour this evening, for those of you who want to continue this partnership conversation. But Brett, Humera, David, thank you so much. Thanks all for coming. Much appreciated.